I'm David Kirkpatrick. I'm a journalist, a business journalist for many years, covered tech for most of my career, but I've made a very decisive pivot to covering climate now. And one of the things that I've learned, and I'm not a Wall Street expert, I always tried to stay away from it, but there's no question that success in the climate response and the energy transition and the societal transition that's necessary is going to depend almost more than any other factor on whether we can marshal enough capital to invest in the things that need to happen. And that the amounts that are going to be needed are shockingly large, in the trillions annually by most evaluations. So what we have here are three different kinds of investors who participate in the climate investment ecosystem in different ways, and in ways that in some instances overlap, intersect, and reinforce one another. So just quickly, so we have a nonprofit investor. Mastercard has set up this center really as a philanthropic operation. Then what Calvert Impact does is really invest for returns, but not only for returns. And really is very much as involved, as Jen will explain, in basically creating investable projects and helping communities figure out what they need to do and then taking it into an execution. Whereas Brooks at Macquarie, his company is the largest owner of infrastructure in the world. Okay, that's how big it is. And they really own and operate and create gigantic infrastructure projects. But interestingly, it's possible that an investment, a company, might have intersected with all three of these investors or ones like them. And increasingly, this is the key for climate investment success. This notion of blended finance, layered finance. So you have philanthropic capital, you have what could be called concessional capital, which wants returns but is willing to take more risk. And then you have hardcore, looking for returns with, a social lens still being in place. And making those things work together is kind of one of our biggest challenges. So we're just going to first hear from each of them to talk about what their organizations do. So Ali, tell us what the center is and how you think about investing.
Yeah, great. Such a privilege to be here. I am so inspired by all the other speakers, so thank you for the invitation and the introduction, David. So Ali Schmidt Fellner, I work at the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth, which was founded in 2014. And we are the philanthropic and social impact hub of Mastercard, the company. We are what we consider ourselves a non-traditional philanthropic foundation because we try to bring to bear the philanthropic capital alongside core competencies and expertise from across Mastercard. There is actually a lot of in-house expertise on financial inclusion, which I'll get to in a moment, as well as data science expertise, AI experts. And so we thought that there was something really powerful about embedding that inside of a global payments company. So our mission is to advance inclusive growth around the world. And we do that through three core pillars. One I mentioned is financial inclusion. Another is support for small businesses globally. And the third is the role that data science plays in social impact. Importantly for this group, we have a fairly new cross-cutting strategic pillar called inclusive climate action. While we haven't been in the climate and nature space for very long, I'm sure it is no surprise to anyone in the room that there's a need for everybody to think about the impacts of climate change on the world's most vulnerable populations and financially vulnerable populations. And so I'm happy to get into more detail on how we're thinking about that.
Yeah, I want to hear about that. So Jen, you can sort of pick up on that because that's not too far from your priorities.
Right. And again, a pleasure to be here. Really fun to be in Sun Valley and with this group because our work has been going on 30 years. And the longer it goes on, the more I find it takes a village. And I'll explain that. And I think your analogy at the beginning, this conveyor belt of capital between the three of us, is completely accurate. We've been around 30 years trying to connect capital to communities. And different is we start with community and back into investors, really what community needs are. And when we try to then make the returns work so they fit what investor needs and return expectations are, we usually end up in the world of blended finance. Calvert Impact is a platform, a suite of products. We have a corporate bond, a community note offering. It's been in existence for 30 years, $3 billion has been raised, and we primarily lend to intermediaries because what we found is we sit close to the capital markets and we invest in intermediaries that sit closer to community. And if you think of a piece of plumbing where water is moving through, and in this analogy, it's dollars moving through from investor to community, we have found there's multiple layers of intermediary that dollar goes through to get to community. And if we don't have the capillaries, the pipes all the way down to community, so these community intermediaries in communities, in sectors like sustainable ag, affordable housing, small business lending, in debt and equity, strong and vibrant, the money won't make it to the last mile. And so we really invest in the intermediary structure, trying to build up that capacity. And so funny enough, a lot of the deals we've invested in, I've seen over the course of the afternoon. So we purchased, for example, the first blue bond that was issued by the Seychelles. It was a $15 million issuance, too small to go to the capital markets. So 3 institutional investors, us being one, bought it. We have a book of 100 different deals like that right now, reaching around the globe. We've then created 2 asset-backed securities, one around decarbonizing buildings, one around small business, and we also have a private equity fund focused on minority banks. And then the big kahuna, which Amy mentioned at the top, is we were just awarded $7 billion from the EPA under the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. And this gets into acronyms, so I'm just going to slow down for a minute.
About an hour ago.
Exactly, which Stacy, I think, just mentioned, there was 3 competitions. One was Solar for All, really states and governments, local governments to get solar on all facilities. One is called CCIA, the Clean Communities Investment Accelerator. Like it sounds, it gets grant capital to accelerate community lenders to do more climate lending. And then $14 billion to 3 awardees. We got 7. There was a $5 billion and a $2 billion awardee to really invest in proven technologies and get them to scale, primarily in Justice 40, so low and moderate income, rural, tribal communities where the money isn't going now, so that we all transition to a low carbon economy together. That's the point of our capital. And so I hope that we're working together in this type of way, because for that money to go out, that $7 billion, there's 6 things that need to be true. 2 of them is it's catalytic, so it is concessionary. It has to be where traditional, private capital isn't going today. And 2, it has to be married with private capital. So hopefully that $7 billion will become 27, will become $100 billion, and it can really begin to solve the trillions that you articulated at the top.
How much money do you manage overall?
About 10 right now.
10 billion. And you seek returns, but when you get returns, you reinvest it because you are a nonprofit.
We are a 501c3.
Right.
So, I heard Patagonia's story, I resonate with that. We are a for-profit running a sustainable business, but the money we earn goes back into the business.
And the key word for this, to understanding what we're really talking about here, is risk. Because investors can only take so much risk, and it depends on how they fall in the ecosystem, how much risk they can take. So basically, from right to left, you're going to lower risk. She can take unlimited risk because she's just giving money away. She's trying to ameliorate his risk, in effect, by taking more. So, Brooks, I'm hoping that's teeing you up a little bit.
That's a great segue. Yeah, thank you very much. I don't own Macquarie, but I do work there.
Did I say you own it?
It was my company.
Oh, well, yeah.
So Macquarie is not as well known, I think, in the United States. It's actually an Australian company. And it is the largest owner-operator of infrastructure in the world. In the United States, we own things like Puget Sound Energy, which is up in Seattle, Long Beach Container Terminal. We're actually the second largest. We're the largest owner of ports, private ports in North America. And at one point, we actually owned the cell phone towers that are just south of town here as well. But anyway, infrastructure is toll roads,
Railroads,
airports, data centers, fiber, all these different things. The thing that, and the infrastructure asset class sort of has been around for about 30 years, and it fills a very specific purpose in people's investment portfolio. It is supposed to be inflation-linked, low volatility, very stable, asset-backed, reliable returns. And our investor base, about $600 billion of capital that we've raised from various folks, is a lot of pension money and insurance money. And pensioners, medical workers in Michigan, police officers in Pennsylvania, Texas teachers, what have you, they're not interested in us making a bet on NVIDIA or crypto or whatever, because if we shoot the moon and get a 5X, it doesn't make a whole lot of difference. They're still just paying their pharmaceutical bill or their electric bill, and they just need that stability. So rule number one in infrastructure investing is don't lose money, because that is a store of value that is just super important for insurers and pensions who are not managing for upside, they're managing for liabilities. They have liabilities. They owe this teacher this much per month every year for as long as she lives. And they owe this homeowner this much insurance coverage for as long as they own the house. And so it's a very different style of investing, but there's a ton of money. This infrastructure asset class has been growing at 25% CAGR over the past, I think it's like 6 years or so, whereas asset management in general is only growing about 6%.
25% CAGR is compound annual growth rate.
Yeah. So I think the point is two things. One is there's a lot of money for this kind of asset if you can produce that kind of risk profile. And the second thing is that this kind of asset is very aligned to climate-oriented investing. So as David and I were talking earlier, Macquarie was the first large asset manager in the world to commit to managing its assets to global net zero by 2040, 10 years ahead of Paris. Why would we do something like that with this enormous sort of gritty, industrial kind of asset base? Because we want our assets to be worth, a certain amount at a certain time. And if we have...
Wait, I'm sorry. So in other words, you presume climate change is going to be so bad that if your companies don't act to reduce the likelihood of it being bad, they will be hurt financially.
Well, it's three things. It's one is if we own a port, we don't want it to be underwater, right? So there's an adaptation resilience element to it. Secondly, if we own a power plant and it's a coal plant, we want to be able to insure it. And insurers have been walking away from coal. We want to be able to lend against it, and lenders don't want to lend to coal plants. We want to hire good teams. So it's probably not a good idea to be owning a coal plant in the long term. And then the third reason is that assets that have a lower carbon footprint profile are just going to be worth a lot more than something that has problems or is contributing to the problem. So part of our fiduciary motivation to make sure that we are really a reliable long-term store of value is to make as absolutely sure that we are owning sustainable assets, because we own the Goethals Bridge that goes from New Jersey to Staten Island. That's a 67-year contract.
You own that?
I mean, you want to buy a bridge?
You own a lot of stuff, man.
That's a 67-year contract, right? That is such an uninteresting, investment from a return perspective, but from a pension or insurance, that's a great opportunity to have. It's got a 67-year cash flow, but you got to make sure that it's going to be sustainable, right? And it's going to survive winds and hurricanes and Superstorm Sandys and so on and so forth. So anyway, I'll wrap up there. Sustainability is integral to that low risk profile of our asset base.
And I want to get back in a little while to some very creative work you're doing, particularly the thing in India. But if we have time, I'd love you to talk about how your portfolio of projects responded when you made that net zero by 2040 pledge, because that was interesting too. But Ali, let's go back to you. Talk about how you think about how your work affects the ecosystem of other investors.
Yeah, so we have four approaches really to our investments. We view our approach to be enabling philanthropic capital, the in-kind support I mentioned as well. So the first is pure research, understanding the problems that we need to investigate further. We actually, as an example, have an exciting project with Amy Christensen and her team to do a global landscape analysis of small businesses around the world and the risks and opportunities in the face of climate change. What are the pressures that small businesses in the US versus the global South versus Europe are up against with, ESG regulations versus climate adaptation and resilience, which we covered earlier today, and how can we support them? Offering advice in particular to the global philanthropy landscape. So research is one. The next is supporting incubators and challenges, some of which we do in-house and some of which we support impressive catalytic prizes. So the Earthshot Prize, some of you may be familiar
These are
with.
really new things that are just emerging.
Sure, yes. New things just emerging. We're trying to always see around the corner on what questions haven't yet been answered or what innovators are out there at the cutting edge who need support. We are not evaluating their commercial viability yet. We are giving them runway and exposing them to different types of investors, whether those be looking for a commercial return or they might be a nonprofit innovator. So that's a second category. A third is piloting nonprofit interventions. And a fourth is de-risking loans for underserved segments of society. So this is either with respect to addressing climate change or our wider portfolio of inclusive growth. And happy to get into any of
So
those.
some of those elements allow entities to emerge that wouldn't otherwise get any money at the outset,
Right.
that later could be really investable assets for people like Jen or Brooks.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. Yes, we have a global challenge that's live right now. It's an AI to Accelerate Inclusion challenge. Winners will get $200,000. That is a grant. We ask them to measure impact. And they also get in-kind support from Mastercard. And that AI challenge actually is likely to have a climate adaptation and resilience lens. So we'll be showcasing some of the real innovators in that space and happy to connect them with investors down the line. But these are very early stage and are supposed to represent for the wider investor community the North Star of promising new solutions, right? And start to ground the space as it becomes more sophisticated.
Yeah, we're really seeing this ecosystem here. So Jen, you talked about the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund money that you got, the $7 billion, but you also do a ton globally, right? So, but I guess you should just talk about a little more in detail, what would be a typical project that you would get involved with, and because in a way you do something similar to what she does sometimes, because you actually help a community figure out what they need to build from the beginning.
Yeah, that's true. And maybe I'll play off a small business since that was one of the priorities that Ali laid out. And we've worked with small businesses for a long time in different ways. When the economy shut down during COVID, we saw the smallest of small businesses in our society totally go dark. And if you recall, the government gave money through the PPP program, but that went through larger banks. A lot of small businesses do not go to a large commercial bank for their capital. They go to a small local bank. And so all that government money was flowing through these large banks, not through community banks where many of these businesses go. And so they weren't able to access it. And that's when the light bulb went off in our head and we said, we need to intervene. Or else we're going to lose this whole segment of our society. And these are businesses of like 10 FTEs or smaller, very small, hairdressers, corner stores, bakeries, et cetera. And so we created liquidity funds around the country, about $850 million, $1 billion worth of them, and funded about 6,000 to 7,000 businesses, stood them up in states around the country, about half of the states. And what they did is these liquidity funds were blended finance vehicles. So they had philanthropy or state money on the bottom, willing to lose all their money. They had corporate or more institutional, I liked your analogy with risk, lower risk capital on top. And what they did is they bought loans off of the balance sheet of community lenders. And that's important because community lenders were the only people investing in these businesses, and these businesses needed more capital than these community lenders could provide. So if we took these loans off of their balance sheet, they then could do more in communities. And so, like I said, we did a lot of this. And then, fortuitously, the US government, the US Treasury came out with a program under the Jobs Act. It's called the Small Business Credit Initiative. And that gave every state a pot of money to ensure small businesses had access to capital. And what we've been doing now is to create a national program with that government money, where we will buy loans state by state. We're setting this up. We got a $140 million warehouse from Goldman Sachs, so we're putting the loans in there when we buy them from the community lenders. When we get enough of them, about 200 million, or 100 million, excuse me, we'll then put that state money beneath those loans. So this is that state money, or the Treasury money I mentioned. So say you put 100 million of that Treasury money beneath the 100 million of loans that we've now bought up all around the country and held in this warehouse at Goldman Sachs until you're ready. And we're going to take that 200 million and we're going to go to institutions, not quite you, but someone that would want it, and say, hey, this is an investment grade asset-backed security. The assets are these small businesses. Would you like to buy it for your pension fund, for your endowment, et cetera? And the big aha here is these small businesses have never had access to the capital markets. Once we can pierce in there with all this financial structuring, what that means is they will have reliable, sustainable capital in the future. And one of the things, and we see this with communities with climate, we see this with shocks like COVID, is there's no resilience in these communities, right? These businesses don't have a lot of oopsie, right, if things go wrong. Everything is to the penny. You see this in nonprofit organizations. You see this when we make grants. We don't give grants like 200K, here's 100K to do your work, and 100K if you have problems. We just assume everything's going to go right. And what has happened time and time again, I've been in this field now 30 years almost, is there's swings, right? The economy moves through swings. And when the economy for all of us is hard, it's really hard for low-income communities. It's really hard for Native communities because they have no resilience. And so we're trying to create resilience by creating really piping into reliable and sustainable capital from the capital markets so that they can not just make it to the next dip in the economy, they can begin to build wealth over time and not lose it every 5 or 10 years and then rebuild it in the next upswing. Yeah. So that's the big picture. I bet many in the audience are surprised at the complexity of the financial engineering that has to go on in order to get money where it needs to go. And I want to go to Brooks, but I want to come back to you also, because even though that's a great story and really pertinent to aligning profit and people, 80% of your work is around climate now. So I want you to maybe talk a little bit about that, like the energy things you do in communities, Alaska, et cetera. But I want you to tell the story about what you've done in India and how different kinds of capital is working together there to allow you to do what you're doing.
Yeah. Okay, but maybe just to pick up on something you said, which is a fascinating example, that state money that provides that different risk profile you talked about, I'm assuming that you are intending to pay that back at some point. It's not just first loss because it will disappear. It's just there for protection. And I think that's a key thing. People talk about first loss capital as the philanthropic capital that's going to disappear. But actually, it's just risk mitigation. And if you have a really talented manager like Calvert, it's going to come back and you can recycle it. So that's a segue then to the example that David mentioned. So one of the things that I'm hoping that, like, most people think infrastructure is halfway between mildly interesting and dead boring. I'm gonna try and make it really exciting for you here. We have a fund in developed markets, the Energy Transition Solutions Fund, which is doing all sorts of cool stuff with hydrogen and EVs and green ammonia and grid-scale batteries and all these sort of, all the technology, all the infrastructure that needs to be built to serve a low-carbon future but doesn't really exist now. So that's all cool, but it's all happening mainly in developed markets because that's where the risk profile fits the teachers and medical workers and police officers I mentioned. So now
There's less risk to invest in a country like this than in Mozambique. Or
yeah,
whatever.
yeah. If you're going to own a wind farm, can it please be in Indiana versus Dakar or something? But India, is a massive country, obviously, and with tons of buses that have always been run on fossil fuels. We wanted to see if we couldn't accelerate the transition to EVs. Because we have an investment doing that here in the United States called Inspiration Mobility, but in India, it's just harder because you could do everything right, as you were saying, Jen, and then the Indian rupee could do this. And that's out of our control. So what we've done with the UN Green Climate Fund is we've put in place a structure quite similar to this. It's $200 million of first loss capital and $200 million of private commercial capital, $400 million total. That capital, plus some of the work that we did with the Indian government to help change sort of the tax treatment of leases, allows us to probably lever that up to another $1 billion US dollars of asset-backed leases and financing loans, corporate debt, and so on and so forth, to create a $1.5 billion platform to accelerate the transition of the Indian bus fleet to EVs. So we provide the bus, we will replace the battery after 7 years, we will provide the charging, we'll do all the maintenance and everything else. And the way that we can get our conservative capital into that deal is we can say, look, there's this cushion here that if the rupee does this, temporarily or permanently or whatever, you still have a protected 11% return, which is a fine return for a pension, particularly in this setting. And we're going to try and grow this business. What we're underwriting it for is a return north of 20%, and we will absolutely intend to pay back the GCF, the Green Climate Fund, their principal plus 6%. But it's that blended capital that allows us to mobilize $1.5 billion into a business that didn't exist last year.
But just to be clear, so even though the $200 million coming from the Green Climate Fund is something they want to get paid back for and they'd like a little return, if they lost it, they're not going to slit their wrists as badly as you would if you lost some of your money. That's sort of the psychology, right? But this $1.4 billion project would not have been possible without that UN-backed money that's willing to go in at at higher risk.
Absolutely. I mean, this business would be a startup bootstrap. You'd try and raise 5 million, then you'd try and raise 10 million, and then you'd go sort of year by year for 7 or 8 years. This money allows us to go from 0 to 60, in a very short period of time, and motivate that capital at scale to a problem of scale.
Right, but we need a company like Macquarie to basically design the whole system and manage it and hire the people, et cetera. This is very similar to what you do. It's a bigger scale thing probably than what you typically would do. But talk about what things like that you do.
Yeah. And so almost similar, but different market. In sub-Saharan Africa, we have about 100 million invested over the last decade because about 10 years ago, a pay-as-you-go, putting solar on individual homes became a new market. The idea that a person could get their house electrified if they got a solar panel that they leased, they would make monthly payments on. The thing is, those were new business models. People did not believe that people would pay for solar so that they could have electricity. So demand was in question, the business model was in question, so no one wanted to provide capital. So we started investing in those businesses directly, but used blended finance because, like Brooks, we did not have the risk tolerance to lose our money. We needed some type of philanthropic, so we used philanthropic partners, Shell Foundation being one, others too, to go underneath us. And we
even you need to be de-risked.
We even need to be de-risked all the way through, exactly. And we ended up investing in a lot of directly in these companies. Then we started to invest in the intermediaries, the financial institutions that were financing those companies. Because again, if you go back, if we want a thriving business ecosystem of these pay-as-you-go solar businesses. They need financing from somewhere. And the local banks in Africa were not going to get comfortable with that business model. So we started to invest in impact funds and other local businesses or local communities that would understand those businesses over time. 10 years later, we have a flourishing sector. There's bumps, there's lumps, there's other things. But our big goal now is to get that sector so there's enough data so that investors see it as not very risky, and I can pass it over to the Brooks of the world. That's my goal over the next 5 years.
I swear that timer just
It flew.
jumped. But anyway, we apparently have to wrap. I was going to ask you to comment. Any quick comments on anything that they've been saying?
It really resonates what you're saying. I will offer one brief example about how we play into that de-risking kind of supply chain, if you will. We try to de-risk the financial intermediaries or DFIs, who then de-risk the banks, who can then lend to underserved or underbanked populations. In our case, we're focused on women-owned businesses or those who haven't been banked before. And so that's a place. In India, we did that with USAID, DFC, and HDFC. And so that's also a way we can kind of contribute to this sort of set
Fantastic.
of
And I just wanted to make one point before we go, because we're going to end. Don't worry. What you hear from Jen in particular and from NIA Impact Capital before, these are very unusual organizations, both led by women, interestingly. But there really isn't another business like Calvert, nonprofit like Calvert in the United States. You said there's sort of 4 others. They're all in Europe. We need a lot more. But you don't think that what she's doing is common. It's extremely innovative, and we just need more of it. I wish we could go on, but I think you get a picture of how complex but how exciting this financing of the transition can be. So thank you to all 3 of you.